Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our Education for All panel tonight. My name is Sidra. I am a CESAR volunteer and your host for tonight. Before we begin the program, we're going to acknowledge the land that we're on. So I know because of COVID, we're all participating in this event tonight from different places. So to pay respect to the lands that you're on, you can use native-land.ca to look up the land rights that are specific to that territory. Toronto and Ryerson University are in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon territory is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And now to begin with the introduction of our panel tonight, I would like to introduce you to our amazing guests, Alannah, Ankit, Kayla, and David. So first off with Alannah. Alannah Mckay is the National Treasurer of the Canadian Federation of Students. She has been actively involved with the Canadian Federation of Students Manitoba as the former treasurer and the University of Manitoba Indigenous Students Association, where she served as a co-president and director of finance and previously served as University of Manitoba Students' Union Indigenous Community Representative. Alannah used her positions to push for spatial and cultural recognition for BIPOC students in post-secondary institutions. Our next speaker is Ankit Tripathy. Ankit Tripathy is an international student hailing from India. He is a fourth-year student at Trent University, majoring in environmental science and business admin at the Peterborough campus. He is a student organizer at his campus with the Trent International Student Association and Trent Central Student Association. He is also an international students representative at the Canadian Federation of Students National. In his role, he is working on ways to mobilize more international students in Canada's student movement and demand for better treatment from governments and educational institutions overall, and to be included in a publicly funded post-secondary education model, OHIP, and other public services. Our next speaker for tonight will be Kayla Weiler. She is the National Executive Representative for the Canadian Federation of Students, Ontario, where she helps coordinate the campaigns and services of the student movement, both nationally and provincially. Kayla served 2 executive terms at Local 54, University of Guelph Central Student Association, as the Vice President External Affairs. At her local, she worked on building students and worker solidarity with COOP 1334 and 3913, fought for free education through the Fight of Fees campaign, and pushed for fossil food divestment with Fossil-Free Guelph. Kayla is passionate about access to clean water and has worked with Wellington Water Watchers in their fights against Nestle. Kayla recently graduated from University of Guelph with a bachelor's degree in history. And last but certainly not least, we are pleased to have David Aldama Pando with us. David is the third secretary of the Embassy of Cuba in Canada and in charge of academic affairs and relations with Cuba Solidarity Groups in Canada. David Aldama has a bachelor's degree in international relations from Raul Garcia Higher Institute of International Relations in Havana. We thank you all for being part of this panel. Before we begin the event, we want to make sure that we are all on the same page. We know that a lot of us might not have thought about Cuba before and have much of a background on the island. I also know that a lot of people watching likely have a second window open tuned into the elections in the United States. On a similar night as tonight, in the early 1950s, a right-wing government in Cuba was about to be defeated at the polls by social democracy. But right before this could happen, a right-arm coup funded by the United States took place. It is during this time that many Cubans began forming a resistance to fight this coup. Over time, this resistance grew to the point that it forced the coup out of Cuba, and Cubans were at last in charge of their own governance. Cubans began to rethink of many ways to improve the lives of everyone on the island. This included re-imaging education, healthcare, sexual health, and much more. We also must acknowledge that while Cubans achieved free education through revolution, free post-secondary education is incredibly common throughout the world, and it is our institutions that are not the norm. We are here to discuss free education. We have with us a panel of experts that will hopefully help illustrate to everyone watching that free education is accessible, reasonable, and overdue. Lastly, before we begin with questions, we would like to express our movement solidarity with Cuba. We continue to call on the Canadian government to pressure the United States to end this illegal and unjust blockade on Cuba and encourage everyone watching to do the same. So before I begin, if you do have your own questions, please leave them in the Q&A if you are watching on Zoom or in the chat if you're watching on Facebook Live. So my first question for this evening will be for Kayla first. So Kayla, can you give us an overview of the current situation for the Ontarian students?
Sure. Thank you, Sidra, for the amazing presentation or introduction to our panel tonight. So thank you so much. So part of my role is I'm the Ontario representative for the Canadian Federation of Students. So I sit on the national executive to represent the province. And so some of the situations for Ontario students right now that we're seeing is that on average, Ontario students pay $8,000 for their tuition, but that is just the tuition for domestic undergraduate students. And it doesn't even start to talk about the high tuition fees that international students pay. So Ontario students pay some of the highest tuition fees in the country. And this is even after a 10% reduction and tuition freeze in 2019. And so this has been a result of decades of underfunding of education. So for example, in 1992, the average tuition fees in Ontario were roughly $1,000 and $1,600, and that was for full-time undergraduate domestic students. But when we look at the tuition fees for Ontario now in 2020, they're almost $8,000 for domestic students, and they've reached $38,000 for international undergraduate students. When we look at the graduate level, tuition fees are on average $9,000, and international graduate students pay $23,000 per year for their education as well. So we're seeing that students are paying more, but they're getting less from their education because Ontario also has the lowest per student funding in comparison to the national average. So Ontario, this is like funding per student to the provincial government paying to institutions. It's less than $8,000 in comparison to the national average, which is $12,000 per student. So we're seeing that Ontario has invested less money into our public education system. And yet Ontario students have some of the highest and the largest class sizes. Ontario students have the worst student to faculty ratio, with many faculty working part-time contracts at our institutions. And students are struggling with the $670 million cut to the Ontario Student Assistance Program, which happened in 2019. There are so many different issues with the OSAP program, and one of these major issues is that not everyone qualifies for OSAP, including part-time students. They don't qualify for an OSAP program. And if students do qualify for OSAP, they receive loans that result in student debt and high interest fees on that student debt that students will continue to pay long after they've graduated. So this decades of underfunding to education has led to this increase of tuition fees, and has actually opened the door for more private investments from corporations to invest in our education system, which has an influence on the academic autonomy of our institutions. Just to have some more facts and figures to also give the sense of what Ontario education is like. In 1992, 83% of university operating revenue came from government grants. So education was more publicly funded in the 1990s. And now in 2020, less than 50% of college and university operating revenue comes from the government grants. So this means that over 50% of the money that is going towards colleges and universities comes from the pockets of students. And for example, my own institution, I went to the University of Guelph, less than 30% of the funding that at that institution came from the government. So just to summarize, we are paying so much more for our education, yet the quality of our education hasn't increased. It's actually rather decreased with the workload that many students and graduate students take on in our education system. So there's definitely an issue, and there's a funding issue in Ontario's education system.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of good information that you provided us all with. My next question is for Ankit. Ankit, a way many schools have made up the shortfall of public funding has been by increasing tuition fee. Could you walk us through some reasons why this is not sustainable?
Yes, happy to do so. So public education is called public education because it started out being publicly funded. But over the years, as Kayla so very well mentioned, that this access to public education has been reduced by reducing the funding to public education. And that leads to a lot of things that we have noticed over the last 20 years that are unsustainable. Why is that unsustainable? I'd like to approach this by starting with an analysis of debt. First, we're going to analyze other things eventually. But starting, as tuition fees rises, that means that students need to take on debt through things like OSAP, need to take on loans to access education. And this means that students who need more, who are, let's say, in a lower socioeconomic class, need to take on more debt. And that means that those who are well off can afford tuition, whereas those aren't need to take on debt. And that means over a long period of time, people who are in a lower socioeconomic class actually pay a lot more for the same education that they would get. And that is assuming that two people are in the same program at the same university entering in the same year. So me and, let's say, a fellow student of mine, if we both started in 2016 in the fall, taking the same program of, let's say, business and environmental science, had the same tuition fees. I have a loan, they don't. And that means that over the course of 4 years, I accumulate debt, I accumulate interest, and I have to pay that back for the 30 years that follow. So for somebody who's better off, that means that the period of time that I am spending trying to pay back my debt is the period of time they use to, and assuming we both make the same income, they would use that same period of time to accumulate that same amount of money and build a stronger financial baseline. And this essentially leads to an exacerbation of wealth and income inequality that we have seen in Canada. And this is also assuming that the post-secondary education after you graduate, the experience is the same for these two people. And I'm also I'm not mentioning yet how OSAP as a program leaves out hundreds of students in Ontario, and different loans programs across Canada leave out a lot of students that actually need them quite a bit. As tuition fees rises, we would then talk about the cost itself and its impact on student retention. Now, education is a lump sum investment. If you speak to an economist, that's how you discuss in education. It's a lump sum investment. And it's a highly risky one. If you put the same amount of money in any kind of a stock market, you will get a lot more. I am not a fan of capitalism, but this is how capital markets work. And if you were to put the same amount of money towards a 4-year degree or a 3-year general degree or a 2-year certificate program, you get zero benefit from it, at least on paper. If you stop anywhere even half a credit short of your degree requirements, zero. You may have spent over $100,000 and you get none of it. And that means to continue making our ends meet, pay this ongoing debt and meet the costs of tuition, a lot of us tend to work during our time in university. As costs rise more, we also need to work more. And we all know that the minimum wage in Ontario and in Canada has not actually kept up with the cost of literally anything. And this eventually leads to a lot of burnout amongst students. All of those who are here today, we all know we had breakdowns last week, the week before that, and the week before that. And we know this is not over. The coming weeks are not going to be any better until the end of December. And that's when you take the winter break to try to recover from burnout. Right? Why does this happen? This happens because the cost of education is high enough to have an impact on our mental health. this directly impacts the retention rate of students that are in our institutions. So those students who could not stay in university as a result of these costs have to drop out and get zero benefits. These are probably also these are likely the students that also needed to stay in university a lot more than everybody else who was able to afford them. So we discussed mental health, we discussed financial abilities, and we discussed income inequality. And finally, I want to touch on something that Kayla did already mention, and that is the commercialization of research and the programs that are offered in our university. Kayla did a great job of highlighting that when our institutions have to rely on private money for conducting research, that also means that it compromises the neutrality of the research that an institution and said researchers may produce. But on a different note, this also means that programs that are deemed unprofitable are also slowly reduced in, they tend to lose funding. They tend to lose the pool of funding that their institution provides them. And does this mean that humanities and arts are worth less, are not as good to study as students? No, because these programs actually identify a lot of the things that are in our societies much better than any sciences or business ever could, right? How do you take culture studies and understand that, and this is something I learned from a culture studies elective, that when we continue to commercialize education, it changes the kind of people that end up here, because cost produces that barrier. And through that barrier, the people who end up in post-secondary education are traditionally a little bit better off, a little bit higher up in the socioeconomic class, and a lot less empathetic to the lives of people who are not in the same class as them. And I'm talking about class so much because it has a major impact in the kind of discussions I've had in lectures. And this doesn't mean that history or ancient Greek and Roman studies or English is less valuable than business, psychology, environmental science, or engineering, right? Their value, you can't assign a dollar value to any of these things. And finally, and let's talk about diversity. When costs of education rise, that means the systemic racism that has led folks to end up in lower socioeconomic class shows up again. That means people of color in Canada have less access to post-secondary education, which changes the direct demographics of the people that are in the classes with us. That is the impact that it has. And universities try to make up for this by creating stupid programs. If we joined hands and really fought for free post-secondary education, then you wouldn't have to worry about creating diversity through what I like to call liberal programs. None of this screams sustainable to me, and I don't know about you. And if you haven't noticed, I haven't talked about international students yet. And I'm not going to, because I'm going to let you understand that without considering international students, there are already so many problems with a increasing cost and privatization of our post-secondary education model. This is not going to get anywhere.
And made it free. How is it that an impoverished country such as Cuba is able to afford this, but a wealthy country such as Canada is not?
Well, thanks so much for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you, with these distinguished friends. Well, as you said, Cuba is a poor country. For that, it's a very huge effort, the one that made possible that we have free education in Cuba. But I think the first step for having this free education is a political will. I mean, in Cuba, since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, one of the main goals was having, how can I say, is having a good and a free and a quality education for all the people in the country. I mean, people who want to study in Cuba, you just study. I mean, it's just being in Cuba, and since you are 5 years old, you can go to the school and you can be a PhD if you want. You can have a bachelor degree. It's just like you want to do it. You have the skills for do it, and you do it just like that. And that's a lot of work for the country. And the main principle that our Cuban government uses for this, I mean, for having this free education, is be educated to be free. I mean, that was said by the national hero of Cuba, Jose Marti. and that's alive today. I mean, Cuban government makes all the efforts to have the most, the best system of education that we can have right now. But I'm just going to put some numbers in the table, in the discussion. Cuba uses almost 1,000 millions of Cuban pesos to education. That's around 25% of the GDP, which for a country as Cuba, which is not too rich, for not saying that we are a poor country, it's a lot of money. I mean, for our economy, the most important thing is education and health. And we just give the 25% of the GDP to education. Almost more than 1.5 million students go to a school for free in Cuba since the elementary levels. And also in the universities, we have more than 250,000 students who go to the university for free. That's a lot of work, as I said. And you can find the university in all the provinces in Cuba. Most of them, and the specialized ones, are in Havana. For instance, we have the Institute of International Relations, the one that I graduated 5 years ago. I'm not too old. And it is one important thing of this political will that I told is that it is recognized in the Cuban Constitution, the new one, the right to a free and equality education. It's a constitutional right. And that's the first, that shows that, education is important because it's the future of the country, it's the future of the world. And also, this is just a personal story. It's one of the most beautiful scenes that you can see in Cuba is when all the mornings you see all these students, the one who goes and uses uniform and go to the school in Cuba. And that's such a beautiful scene in Cuba, because you see how safety, how happy feel the children who go to the school. And that's very important for us. That's one of the things that Cubans, we are very proud, and we enjoy it, and we say that we are very proud to have this, because we know that in other countries it's not like that. And we strongly believe that free education is one of the most important things. It is in one of the main objectives of almost all the governments in the world. But here we are. We have a lot of things to show to the world, and that's one of the best.
Thank you so much for letting us know, David. That was really good and helpful. My next question is for Alannah. Alannah, a myth that exists is that Indigenous students have access to free education. Could you give us an overview of what access to education means to Indigenous students?
Thank you. Yeah, so it definitely is a myth. As an Indigenous student, speaking from experience, a lot of people kind of don't understand the status and non-status thing when it comes to Indigenous people, which is a colonial thing input onto Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. So one thing where that misconception comes from is people who do have status and under the Constitution, it's called like the Indian Act. So those who do have that get a chance to get funding, but not all those students who are a part of the community don't even have access to that. There's a lot of barriers when it does come to accessing what is necessarily, their treaty rights. There's still a lot of things that Indigenous students do face when it comes to that. And even then, if a student does happen to have that, there's like a minimum they have to keep up with their grades, and they have to like keep on going. Like if a student goes through like one thing in their life and like it could affect them when it comes to like their community, because it's their community who makes up those decisions on who gets it and who doesn't get it. And even then, a lot of these universities don't have many supports for Indigenous students to succeed. I've learned over the years that this varies from university to university, and how they handle like when it comes to Indigenous students and the supports they have access to is like almost like slim to none a lot of the times. And also like it also varies on like how many Indigenous students are enrolled within that institution, because that's how they like allocate them. That's what they look at to see who's going to be accessing this and using it. And then like one thing that also affects Indigenous students is like some do have to leave their communities to attain a post-secondary education, and then that creates even more barriers because they're like not in their community. They don't have the family support that they need or anything. And then we also have to take in consideration like the last residential school closed down 1996. Like that affects a lot of students as well, and the fact that we have to go within these colonial institutions and be taught this in some sort of capacity. Like a lot of this isn't like taught within like from nursery to like grade 12. So it's just like also a lot of students will be like learning the history as well, and it could impact them, and especially depends on how like the people approach that. A lot of people aren't cognizant of how the way these are like approached. So, and that's like one of the many barriers that they do face, and what access to education for Indigenous students can mean a lot of different things. So I think supports is like definitely the main one in order for Indigenous students to succeed. And there has to be like a difference between on reserve and off reserve to ensure that we are ensuring the success and the achievement of Indigenous students. Like this is what also comprises of that as well, because like I said earlier, if a lot of students, if some of them are leaving their communities, we have to ensure that their mental health is okay. And not many universities offer specific mental health resources just for Indigenous students. So luckily to be in this position, I get to work with the Circle of First Nations, Métis, and Inuits caucus. So one of their main goals this year is to develop a mental health campaign that caters specifically to Indigenous students to ensure their success and make sure they know how to navigate these, because a lot of the times when it comes to Indigenous students, a lot of them are first generation university students. So they're the first ones navigating this for the first time and like paving the path for their family and their kinship. And that's like a big responsibility. That's a lot of responsibility to put on one person. And I completely understand that. So I want to ensure that for those who are like now coming in this path, don't have to face that. And like they're able to access a lot of the things like funding if they're in different kind of capacities, supports for them, mental health resources. And like a big thing we're seeing now is language. A lot of Indigenous students want to they deserve the right to access to learn their own Indigenous language. So, and also that is like another thing with the Federation. Indigenous students started the Reconciliation campaign that calls on to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's called Action 16 for universities and post-secondary institutions to implement Indigenous language degrees within their institutions, because this is a right. Like I feel like Indigenous students now or never, they should never have to fight to learn their own language, especially if they have to pay for it, and they shouldn't even be having to pay for it in the first place. Especially if a university does have an Indigenous Student Center. A lot of the asks these administrations thinks is too much, or they deny those rights to them, or like when it comes to funding, they have to fight years on end to have their voices heard. And then if it is given to them, something is always like taken away to ensure like the asks are put in place, but like that's not what a lot of these students ask for, or Indigenous administration. So, and it's also like a big thing that Indigenous students have access to this. And like I know from my university, at the University of Manitoba, we only have a Native Studies department, and it's always limited. And like I know U of M has one of the highest self-identified rates. We have over 2,400 self-identified Indigenous students. So we need to keep up with that and ensure like these Indigenous students have access to language, have access to mental health, and make sure like that these supports are being catered, because we need to ensure that for the next generation that they don't have to go through this, that they're able to learn their language, that they're able to access all of this without having to fight for it. I believe that's what access to education means for Indigenous students, to ensure that they have these kind of things, especially for the ones who are leaving their communities or the ones who have to give up a lot just to attend post-secondary education. Like, what is it, 40, 50, it wasn't even 40, 50 years ago that Indigenous people either had to choose their status or lose their status just to go to university. Like, and yet a lot of us who do take on these roles and being the first to break down those barriers, it's a lot. So we always have to fight for something, and we have to fight for literally everything. Actually, not something, it's literally everything. So, and sometimes I don't believe that onus should be just on Indigenous students. So breaking down myths like every Indigenous students get free education, like, no, that's not how it is. And if somebody does have access to that, those communities directly have to, like, the government only provides probably each community with one full funding for one student, and the community themselves have to find the funding elsewhere or allocate their resources somewhere within their community. And like, it depends how big or small they are and how they can even send them. I know from one of my communities is Muskrat Dam, Ontario, who's still on a boil water advisory, which is horrible because it's 2020. And like, I don't think that's right. They are only ever able to send one Indigenous student to post-secondary education. And because that's way up north, like, they have to leave their community, and like, that's where your kinship is. That's where everything is that's where our identity is tied to. So that we take a lot of hits when it comes to things like that. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and awareness on this issue. And, you keep bringing up positive changes to the community. So great work. My next question is actually for all three panelists from the CFS. So why is free education a priority for the Canadian Federation of Students? So Kayla, Alannah, and Ankit, feel free to answer this question. Whoever wants to go first.
I think Ankit, you should go first.
This is difficult to navigate. Thank you. just give me a responsibility. I think I'm gonna keep this extremely brief. Why is this a priority? Because one, there's not a good enough reason for it not to be. Straight up, it's totally possible. Two, and three, logically it makes no sense for it to be privatized or paid. For one, do you apply? Do you pay to apply for a job? No. Do you pay to learn a language when you're just growing up? No. Then why should you have to pay to attend post-secondary education? You didn't pay until you got to grade 12, at least in this country. You don't have to, thankfully. Then why now? It just does not line up. It doesn't. And on a more a real answer for international students specifically, because I did talk about this last time, we come here because we want to come here, but also because oftentimes we don't have other choices. I'm speaking to the refugee students. Okay, when we come here, we're not trying to come here because Canada has things that we can take and leave. No, we come here because we don't have other options, because our lives and livelihoods and communities are threatened where we come from. When you commercialize that, that's disrespectful. Let's also recognize that the conservative Prime Minister of Canada in 2013, Stephen Goddamn Harper, recognized the value of international students and put in place a program that ensured the goal of expanding the number of international students in the country. it's not just for the money. When we come here, we come with experience. We come with soft benefits that people in the community, y'all, enjoy. What would happen to the restaurants around you if there weren't any international students? I'm gonna leave you with that.
Great, thank you so much. Definitely for us to think about. Kayla, did you want to go next?
Sure, I can. So I really like this question because oftentimes when we talk about the work of the Federation, we don't get enough time to talk about free education, but even though we talk about it a lot already, and I think it goes to show that it's students in Canada want a free education system. There's this myth that, we can't afford it, or other myths around free education, and those are all false. In Canada, it would cost $10 billion to have a free education system every year. And currently, the Canadian government spends 3 times that on the military budget. Or let's talk about other budgets that the federal government invests money into, and yet they're not spending the same kind of money into our education system, which is more fruitful and better for our society at large than the other investments that the Canadian government has. And when we're talking about a free education system, there's a couple different arguments, whether it's the economic argument, the moral argument, or the practical argument. But the one that I want to highlight is kind of just talking about education in itself. A friend of mine said to me that education is a gift that one generation gives to the next. And I think that's really fundamental to kind of the work that the Federation does. Students in this country founded the Federation in 1981 because they wanted to have a better system for all. And they knew that they weren't going to win free education in a single year. And so they started this Federation so that we could continue this fight moving forward for future generations. And I think something that I always like to debunk as a myth is that with a free education system, we're no longer going to put money as the priority. We're going to put academics first and money last. So students should be able to study school and study what they're passionate about without having to go into debt. This whole idea that, you study history or you study mathematics or sciences and then you automatically have to assume debt is just ridiculous. It's not practical, it's not moral, and it's not a good economic policy. And also this financial barrier affects every single student. And when it adds to the mental stress and the mental health of students across the country, where students are stressed, they're working several jobs, they're having to pay for groceries, pay rent, and some students are accessing food banks because they simply can't afford education. I've had so many of my friends who've been deregistered from school because they didn't pay their tuition on time. Yet they also didn't have the money in their bank account to pay their tuition on time. I've had other friends, they've dropped out of school because they couldn't afford it. And it wasn't because they weren't getting amazing marks in class, because they were. But they simply had to drop out of school because they couldn't afford it. And that's a shame. It's a shame to see that there are people who are kept out of our education system simply because their pocketbook isn't big enough. Having a national strategy to plan education across the country is also really fundamental because regardless of where you go to school, you should be able to access a publicly funded and high quality education system. So whether you're studying in Ontario or Northern Ontario, or you're studying across the country, it should be free, regardless of which institution you go to. If it's a college or a university, you're an undergraduate or you're a graduate student, you shouldn't have to pay a single dollar to access the knowledge of our institutions. I also just want to say 2 last points is that in 2019, Ontario was actually cited as the richest it's ever been. So Doug Ford and the Premier of Ontario likes to act as if Ontario has just such a big debt, and the province does, but we're also the richest we've ever been. So why is there major cuts to the education system and to the OSAP program? There are better ways to manage the province, and those are just simply being ignored. And I also want to say that this free education system, if we had it in Canada, would be better adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic. There'd be actual funding for research for around COVID-19, but also students wouldn't have to be paying tuition during the middle of a pandemic for a campus that they can't access. And also during this COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that workers have put their lives on the line for in our hospitals and in our educational system, because we're simply just not prioritizing the health and safety of workers and prioritizing education and healthcare, but rather we're seeing the government prioritize profits and prioritize the economy, which is important, but we need to prioritize people and our health and our education and our healthcare system, rather than worrying about the profits for large corporations. And these are the corporations who benefit from having an education system that's highly expensive. So I didn't want to take up too much time because I really want to hear what Alannah has to say. But those are just some of the points I've been thinking about politically lately about our education system. Is it's not expensive. We have the money. We can totally do it. It's just simply that it hasn't been a priority so far from any government in Canada.
Absolutely. Thank you for putting that out so wonderfully. Alannah, you can go ahead and share your thoughts as well.
Thank you. I loved Kayla's answer and Ankit's. Like, thank you. That is amazing. Yeah, one thing I always focus on, and I always talk about this, is like breaking down barriers for the people who come after me, because like these barriers shouldn't be put so high up, especially for like BIPOC students, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And like some of the most smartest people I know have never even went into post-secondary education, and it makes me sad because like in the society, knowledge is like, gaining this knowledge is a privilege, and it shouldn't be, because like knowledge is power at the end of the day, and I feel like everybody should have access to that. And like the amount students pay when it comes to tuition, when it comes to their textbooks, and like everything they have to access is like ridiculous. Like, it's not okay. And like when you go talk to these MPs at the Hill, like you could give them pages of what they should be putting their money towards, what they should be taking away, and they'll be like, no, like, no, like this should be a priority. Like, you didn't have to pay as much as us as we do now. Like, you turn the tables and you're charging us just 3 times more. And international students pay like so much more than domestic students, and that is not okay. And like Ankit said, they come here it's their livelihood. Like, they have to like take this back and everything to their homes and their communities, and like that's horrible that they have to pay so much more than domestic students. And like, and the fact that like I know in Manitoba, like they don't even have healthcare, and that's like not okay. Like, that should not be a thing, and like they should have access to just as much and just as equally, and like so should everybody else. I always talk about like, and I love that Kayla has touched upon this, is like we're protecting the future for our future descendants and the next generation. And like I really hope that like us, everybody on this panel, and all the students who are currently like enrolled or now, especially in a pandemic. And like, I know many universities this semester have been like upping their tuition, which makes it even worse because our classes are online. Like, we do this for a reason, to ensure like free education in the future better be a thing. And if not, like, I was reading this article, they're like, we're coming for everything you took away from us, and like, or you didn't give us right away. And I was like, I love that.
Thank you so much, Alannah, and all three of you really shared amazing points on this and awareness for all of us. And hopefully we can continue to, cooperate and keep on doing great work for our next generations.